So please, shall we resume our works? So as it is already a tradition in IOM's Council, we always have a panel called Migrants Voice. And this year we are very fortunate because we have two special guests that will introduce us to how we should be more attentive to listen to migrants' voices. First of all, I would like to welcome Dr. Nilufar Rahim, medical doctor, member of the Kayan Foundation, resident general practitioner, board member of Kayan Foundation, and project supervisor of clinical skills training program. Did I say it rightly? Yes. Okay, so my notes are correct. Dr. Rahim is a medical doctor from Afghanistan who has been living in the Netherlands since she was 10, so a few years ago. She is a board member of Kayan Foundation since 2008. Within the foundation, she has organized and participated in many projects to support improvement of healthcare and higher education in Afghanistan. And then we will turn to Mr. Nadir Nadi, producer and founder of Benny. Nadir is a content creator and the founder of Benny, a YouTube channel in which Nadir explores untold stories surrounding identity, culture, and representation. He strives to give a platform to those often underrepresented in mainstream media. Thank you so much for joining us, and please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, just a small
Yes.
technical detail.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having us here today. Thank you very much, Mr. Vitorino, for the introduction. My name is Nilufar Rahim, as Mr. Vitorino told me, and first of all, I would very much like to thank IOM International, of course, but also IOM the Netherlands for asking me to be here today and speak to you in front of you about my journey in life and about being a migrant. I'm really, truly honored to be here in front of all of you people who are not only brave enough to talk about these issues, but also to find solutions for the world problems that we have. So I understood that I have to talk about a little bit me, who am I, and what was my journey in life, and how did the migration or being a refugee form my life and myself, and also what do I do in the field of migration, or what do we do with the group that we have. What you see are pictures of me as a kid. The left picture, that's me when I was a baby. I was born in Kabul, in Afghanistan, and of course I don't really remember a lot of that time in Afghanistan, but from what I hear from my parents and my family members, it was a wonderful time back then to live in Afghanistan in peace mostly, and having just an average life and everything else. Preparing this presentation, I actually had to force myself remembering my child memories and remembering when I felt a migrant, or when I became a migrant, or when I became a refugee. I actually don't really know what to call myself. In the past years in the Netherlands, we're even called sometimes gelukzoekers. I don't know if there are any Dutch in the room, but that means happiness seekers. So we're being called a lot of things. I just like to think that I'm a human being, as all of you. But so I was thinking, when is my memory, or what memory do I have from the migration? And to my own surprise, I came to know that my very first memory as a child was the migration, actually. Before that, I don't know anything. I don't remember anything. Maybe I've blocked it, I don't know, or the impact of the journey was that big that I don't remember anything before that. So the very first thing that I remember as a kid is being in a very big truck with my mom and my little sister. I was around 2 years old, and my mom was sitting in the front seat, and my little sister and I were actually kind of hiding below her feet in the front seat and ducking away, not really understanding what we were doing, but that is my very first memory of life. Not realizing that that was me becoming a migrant slash refugee slash happiness seeker for the rest of my life. The journey after that, we lived in Pakistan, we lived in Iran, and then, as Mr. Vitorino told you, I was 10 years old when we came to the Netherlands. It wasn't easy to reach the Netherlands, absolutely not easy, and I remember a lot of horrible things that happened during the journey, but I would very much more like to talk to you about the journey afterwards, because that is when I became me. In the Netherlands, the journey was also not very easy, because as a 10-year-old, you're kind of in the middle. You're not a child who starts at school, at the kindergarten or whatever, but you're also not a grown-up, so you don't really understand what's going on. But we managed with my siblings to learn the language quite quickly and managed to go to school. And before I knew it, I was graduating, and before I knew it, I was admitting myself to med school. So I applied to med school, and I was in med school. It was actually during med school that I, of course, as a lot of people do during university and college, you come to know yourself and you get to know the world better, hopefully, if you look a little bit closer. If you see, these are just a few pictures of my time during university and during my medical school. Of course, I couldn't show you all of the pictures and of all my life, because that would be a very long presentation and quite boring probably for you, because you've also got your own journeys. But during medical school, I always try to seize all the opportunities. I think that is one of the characteristics of migrants and refugees and people who don't get anything for granted or don't take anything for granted. I remember I was 2 years old when I started learning how to read and write with the English alphabet back then in Pakistan, and I remember myself always like that, trying to learn new things and trying to study very hard, sometimes a lot harder than my other colleagues or students at the university, because, well, you always have the baggage and you always have to work harder. I think a lot of people understand that as well, because you need to make sure that everything respects you for who you are and not for your background and not for your for everything that you've gone through. So I applied to every conference that there was and attended every conference that there was. I applied to every internship that there was in the Netherlands, but also abroad, gladly, because through those experiences, I have learned to be who I am, actually, and to be a global citizen. Because I don't think that in the world of today, any one of us have got one nationality. We're all, in my opinion, world citizens, global citizens, who can go anywhere and do anything as far as they want to, and as far as they understand what is needed in the world to be done. So this is a little bit of what I have been doing and how I became myself. I constantly find myself, that's also surprisingly enough for myself, I constantly find myself in kind of a, not really a fight, but in a balance-seeking way of who am I? Am I the migrant, the refugee who needs to do a lot, who needs to do a lot of things to prove herself? Or am I the Dutch citizen who has achieved so much and who is now a Dutch citizen and has achieved a life that a lot of people in Afghanistan, but also in the rest of the world, would only dream of? So when do I cease to be that person who wanted all of those things, and when am I the person who has already achieved a lot and can do a lot more for those who didn't have the opportunities that I have? I think that is the dilemma that I have all my life. That's also why I try to seek manners and ways to do something back, because I was really lucky. I'm really glad that my parents took that decision to leave when I was 2, because it's horrible for any child to go through a war and devastation and not having normal child memories. But the positive thing is, I hope, at least I try to take everything in positive manners. The positive thing or outcome of this whole journey is that I got to experience so many things. I got to see so many places, and I got to know so many amazing people who have influenced me throughout my life. One of those experiences is me becoming a member of foundations such as Kaihan Foundation. Kaihan Foundation was started in 2008. I'd like to tell you just a little bit about a few projects that I have been involved in within the foundation since the beginning. So as soon as I got into med school, I also became a member of Kaihan Foundation. Besides IFMSA, I don't know if you know it, the International Federation of Medical Students Association, and the IPPNW, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. Kaihan Foundation is always very close to my heart because we work in a sustainable manner to support the developments in different sectors in Afghanistan, such as higher education and health, medical health care, which is of course, which are sectors that I can do something for the benefit of the country and for the people in Afghanistan. That is also what we stand for. Our projects are within 3 pillars. We've got development assistance, education, and integration. And I'm not gonna bore you with a lot of organizational stuff, but I'd really much like to tell you about a few projects because IOM has been a major partner in these projects with us from the beginning. And we are all very thankful to IOM the Netherlands and of course the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, who have also supported IOM throughout these phases. A very important project is Anatomy Teaching Innovation Program. As many of you might know, if you've got a medical background or if you know anyone, or you probably all have gone to a doctor sometime in your life. Exactly. I think you understand that anatomy is the backbone of medicine, is the backbone of healthcare. And if any doctor in the whole world doesn't know his anatomy, then it might also be called a butcher, because then you don't know what you're doing and you're just cutting in people instead of animals. Unfortunately, one of the things that got devastated in the war in Afghanistan, amongst a lot of other things, was the medical health care, the curricula in medical schools, but also within that, the anatomy teaching. That was all banned by Taliban. So all of the doctors did not know what they were doing for the past 20 years because they didn't get that taught from anyone. Some of them even stole bones from graves, unfortunately, to understand the anatomy. But what we have done with Kaihan Foundation for the past 10 years, we have tried to restart anatomy teaching at universities in Afghanistan. We have managed to change laws in Afghanistan, which was really hard. It took us 8 years. But we have managed to change laws within the Sharia law to allow, again, anatomy dissection in Afghanistan. And we have managed to bring bodies to Afghanistan. And fortunately, during my last visit in Afghanistan a few months ago, the teachings and the education restarted at the university in Kabul, and we were really looking forward to expanding the projects to other universities as well. And we have also trained 2 medical doctors, 2 surgeons and anatomists from Kabul in order to be able to continue the project and keep it sustainable. What we've also tried to achieve is a mutual understanding, but also mutual exchange in medical knowledge, not only, but also in individual knowledge and personal development for students in Afghanistan, for medical students in Afghanistan. That's why we've organized exchange programs for the past 10 years with the University of Leiden in the Netherlands and Kabul Medical University. During every year, we've received 5 to 10 students from Afghanistan in Leiden University who have studied for a semester in Leiden and then returned back home to share their knowledge with other students at the universities, what makes us really proud, because they've all gained a lot of medical knowledge, but also they've all become another person with a lot of goals in life in order to also benefit the country. A project that is really a kind of a little bit my baby, which I've cherished a lot in the past years, is clinical skills training program. I'm a doctor, as you already understood, and we always say with training, I think within whichever field, you see one, you do one, and you teach one. That's the triangle of getting trained. That is also our motto. I really much like to train and to share my knowledge, which I gained at universities in the Netherlands with students in Afghanistan, which means that medical students in Afghanistan, as I said, within the medical curriculum, they do not get any practical trainings. They just have to learn the curricula, and they're just getting examined in the theory, but no practical knowledge, no practical trainings, which is again really not practical for them, and also giving them, of course, a very high risk of damaging the patients, if I can say so. So we started 5 years ago in cooperation with IOM, a project called Clinical Skills Training Program, in which I train trainers in Afghanistan in different provinces in different essential clinical skills, such as stitching, such as basic life support, advanced life support, airway management, but also very basic things like how do you withdraw blood, or how do you even do an IV cannula for a patient. I would really much like to end my part of the presentation with saying that I truly hope that someday there are no children who have to go through what I have been going through with the journey. Unfortunately, that is really not realistic, and I know that because this morning I just woke up and the very first thing that I saw online was a message about Camp Moria. I don't know, you probably all know about it, in Lesbos on the Greek island, who is householding around 10,000 refugees at this moment as we speak. A few years ago I was working at Camp Moria, and the Turkey deal was just starting, and the people, at least the camp, had a capacity of around 1,000 people, and back then there were 2,000 already within 2 weeks, and at this moment in that same camp there are 10,000 people living through harsh winter climate. I truly hope that one day all of these people who are displaced, like myself, but who are all seeking for a little bit of peace, whether that is their right to happiness or not, I don't know. That is for you and for others to decide and to judge. But I truly hope that everyone can have the opportunities to have a peaceful life, and to have the rights to education and to healthcare and to happiness, because I think that is also a basic human right for everyone. The last photo was of our team within Kaihan Foundation, who are all also migrants and refugees and happiness seekers, who are all working very hard every day within the Dutch society, but also for the Afghan society, in order to make every little piece of world that we can influence a little bit better for other people. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nilufar, for the very impressive testimony. I have a few questions, but now we will shift from medical science to creation. Big job.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to IOM for having me for the second time in a month, I think. It's starting to become like a home from home. Nilufar, thank you for that beautiful presentation. I was hoping yours would be really boring, so mine would look a little bit better, but now I'm feeling a little bit under pressure now to kind of perform after that. It's really inspiring actually to see people doing the real hard work. I'm a creative, and sometimes I think, man, like, I have a living like making videos and stuff, but then there are people doing real work on the grounds where we draw our inspiration from. So I guess that's the kind of nice intersection of my presentation. Today, I'm going to tell you a bit more about myself, again, drawing from my own personal story, specifically my channel called Benny. It was a YouTube channel. It's more developed into kind of a creative space right now. And a lot of the issues I deal with are migration, identity, and storytelling. Can I have the clicker?
Oh, sorry, yes, of course.
It's this one, right?
Yeah.
Cool. Sorry, technical difficulties. Yes, so migration, identity, and storytelling. I'll start with a beautiful picture of my family. This is my mother, my father, and my sister. A very wholesome picture of a family of 4 in London, which is my home. A little bit about me. I actually have a very interesting migration story. I draw ethnic heritage to 4 places. My parents are mixed, Indonesian, Kenyan, Yemeni, and Pakistani. So me and my sister, to put it bluntly and simply, were ethnically confused. Our identity crisis can be defined as being a mishmash of cultures and different dinner food at the table. But it was wonderful. My parents never really culturally prioritized one over the other. It was a very delicately stitched balance of cultural wholesome goodness. And culture became a big part of who I am. And I'm very grateful for that because it's also permeated through my work. Migration, culture, identity, and heritage are paramount to my experience as a young Londoner, and arguably London being one of the cities in the world that was able to encompass that massive identity. So I'm very grateful for the sacrifice my parents went through to be able to give me the life that I was able to express myself freely, but it came with its challenges. This is a kind of a bit of a snapshot into the day-to-day mechanics of my life. Very unique kind of home environment, and it's important I contextualize this because it gives my work a bit of sense. Literally every heritage under the sun. I have cousins who are from Turkey, Syria, Britain, Jamaica, Spain, Colombia, and at home it's just a mishmash. It looks like a United Colors of Benetton advert. Extremely, extremely diverse. People from different backgrounds, lots of different languages. Christmas dinners tends to be a bit confusing because we have lots of turkeys cooked in various ways with various spices, but very fortunate to grow up in an environment that saw culture as something value adding and not as a barrier between people. And I was very lucky and very fortunate to have that. So I always like to thank my parents in the beginning of a speech for giving me that. But as you can imagine, as a son of a very complex heritage and a son of migrants who went through quite arduous ordeals to be where they are today, growing up in London as diaspora was extremely difficult. The best way to describe it is like living tandem lives that are operating simultaneously. There is one circle in which you feel very comfortable in, that most people would live in their whole lives, but then you have another element, and that's the second circle. So the first circle might be your indigenous culture, the culture that you grew up at home. The second might be the one of your adopted country of residence. And then there's a third, which might be your work or your school or your cultural environment that you operate on a daily basis. But then you kind of operate in this weird middle bit, that intersection. And very few people find that middle bit a relatable experience. And it's quite isolating being a migrant or diaspora and living in tandem. I'm sure you'll agree with me, Nilofer, living these tandem lives in which someone might understand one circle, but they don't understand all 3. And you're in this middle, and then you actually feel quite alone in that space. And it's only moments like this where, like, you know, when Nilofer was speaking at moments, I'm like, yeah, girl, I get you. Totally understood, relatable. But then you grow up and you start to realize actually there's a worldwide community of people who find that experience extremely relatable. I wanted to capture that. What was that feeling? There was no word for it. It was something I needed growing up, but it never existed. So that's the kind of context in which my work operates in. And then something massive happened in my life. A moment so formative in my life, it kind of just threw everything a bit haywire. And that was September 11th. I'm sure everyone here is very familiar with the tragic events that happened on that day. But it was a moment in which people from migrant backgrounds, from different minorities, felt like suddenly they were under the limelight for all the wrong reasons. We felt like our identity was under attack. Instead of being able to live in the kind of glory of who we are, we suddenly had to justify our existence in these spaces. And young people who grew up in this context were known as the 9/11 generation. So I would have been part of that. I remember this day. I was very young, but I still remember walking home, opening the door and seeing the TV in the distance and thinking it was a movie being played, and walking in, and on the right seeing my mother on a sofa watching the events and her being morbidly terrified, obviously because of the obvious events that had taken place, but also because of the fear of what might happen afterwards, the fear of she's going to have to worry about her son and daughter walking the streets, and public opinion maybe thinking a lot less of them. And that was terrifying for a parent to go through. So what happened was that mainstream society in the West stopped seeing me as the innocent young boy I was, this cute little boy on the little side of the corner here, and they started seeing me as something quite problematic, a person, an outlier, someone who didn't really deserve to be where they were, someone who was a problem, someone whose values didn't align with theirs. And that kind of confounded my alienation with the society that I was being born and raised in.
Problem with me, I've got
Bro, if you're shouting and swearing at me, I'm walking and he's shouting and he's swearing at me. No stress. Don't swear. Don't walk past me and swear and shout at me. I don't care. I don't care. Don't shout and swear at me.
So that was a video of me, of a typical experience which I managed just to get my camera out in time. But of course, when you're being verbally abused on public transport, your first instinct isn't to get your camera out and film it. But I had arrived somewhere, and basically someone told me, and I won't say the exact words because I would not want to say it in this place, but they told me to go back home in a lot more graphic way. And a lot of migrants and a lot of the diaspora had to go through this experience on a daily basis. Luckily, being born and raised in London, it's not part of my daily experience, but to go through that, you suddenly realize a place that you've felt like home for most of your life, you actually remember, they've never considered this to be your home in the first place. I continued with my life. I kind of felt like my parents wanted for me, as they want for any of their children, they wanted me to do well. But my father always told me, as long as you're beneficial to mankind. I internalized that. I thought that meant a career in humanitarian work and development. I ended up working for the UN after my master's for a while in Palestine, and I was in Jordan. And then that's what I thought my parents wanted. So you go through the motions. But then I kind of felt like there was something missing. I wasn't able to flex a creative bone in my body. And that kind of was nagging at me for a while. And I actually pitched it to my senior boss. I was like, hey, you know what? Video's becoming quite a thing now. And this is quite a long time ago. It's like 6-7 years ago. Video's becoming a thing now. YouTube is kind of emerging as a platform that's part of our daily lives. I was like, it would be amazing to create like some video content, looking at like diaspora identity and maybe doing something to help alleviate some of the stereotypes that are existing within Western mainstream society. And he was kind of like, he didn't really buy it. He was just kind of like, to get back to your work, and it didn't really go anywhere. So I just decided to do it myself. And literally on my family table, there was some change. There was a laptop and a camera. I'd never filmed a video in my life, just to give you context. I never went to film school, never did any of that special technical stuff. It was there. I sent some emails to people I knew, and I made a video. And it's not the most amazingly produced video, but I put it out there not expecting much.
It might seem crazy what I'm about to say. Sunshine, she's here, you can take a break. I'm a hot air balloon that could go to space. With the air, like I don't care, baby, by the way. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like a room without a roof. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like happiness is the truth. Because I'm happy. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you.
So that was a parody on Pharrell's Happy song, which I hope some of you are aware of, because that was a big song. If not, I would Google it. And I did a parody of it, and I put it out online, and I thought about 1,000 people would see it. Just a bit of fun. 1,000 people being my family, because I'm like of Asian African descent, so we got a lot of cousins and stuff, so I thought maybe that would be cool. So I posted it about 7 p.m. Fell asleep because I was exhausted after editing it. And can anyone guess how many views it got in the space of about 7 hours? Just throw a figure at me, Nilüfer. okay, so she's starting high, so whatever I come out with now looks like... It was actually 1.7 million views in the space of like 7 hours around the world. And this is a video in my bedroom that I had made with no technical background, no technical skills at all making videos, but I was able to mobilize a mass global sentiment in literally 7 hours, 1.7 million views, which kind of blew me away. I was getting emails from all the major publications in the UK, academic reports from Harvard, Yale, Cambridge, LSE, people wanting to understand why this was like trending around the world. But this was early YouTube, and it basically just was a new, fresh way of looking at a community that was in the headlines for all the wrong reasons. But of course, like most things, that narrative had been co-opted, and what was occurring was very binary headlines of migrant Muslim identity in the West. So the song was called Happy, but people started creating binaries like, is this happy or is it wrong? Is it haram? And a lot of people had a problem with the video because it felt like it was representing this community that was inherently problematic, but trying to present them as appeasable, as like, you know, happy. And it was this weird kind of narrative that was taking place in mainstream media about Muslim identity, Muslim migrant identity in the West. And I felt like my video had been co-opted in that argument. Thankfully, about 90% of it was positive. But I was like, how do I get out of this binary? How do I create narratives that were not involved in this cyclical relationship of I try to put something out there and someone tries to co-opt it? And this was the problem. I decided at this point that I wanted to make videos for the rest of my life and continue like mobilizing global sentiment. But how did I tackle this problem of whenever there was a narrative I was trying to beat, the counter that I had come up with was still born from the original narrative. So people had always seen me as a problem. People had always seen me as a problem, but I didn't want to counter a narrative that I felt was inherently problematic in the first place, if that makes sense. I wanted to create narratives that were just born out of the wholesomeness of my home. Like, you know, like resistance wasn't part of our daily experience at home. It was just love. It was like culture. It was food. It was things that made life livable, if that made sense. But every time that I only heard like my voice was being heard online when I was countering certain narratives in the news, telling people I'm not a terrorist, telling people I'm not a problem, etc. So I wanted to build a space that did that. And this is when I started my YouTube channel about 2.5 years ago. And then a quick reference to a really cool, to give you contextualize about the stereotypes and how they work in the brain. If you read this really quickly, it says New York in the spring. Now I want to go back, read it again. It says New York in the spring. All right. And your brain, probably 90% of your brain probably missed that. And the reason it does that is called the cognitive frame. Our brains are very lazy. We like to understand things and people in the easiest way possible. So when you see a brown or a black person on your screen, your earliest reference is probably the media that you've watched in your previous life. You don't look at that person and think they're part of a layered narrative that's actually very detailed and lots of context behind it. And that's the crux of stereotypes. We try to find the easiest route possible to narrowly define someone. So I wanted a space that kind of I wanted to create a new approach that kind of went beyond that. I'll speed through this now.
I'm just sick of it.
And my first video was basically an A to Z, going through the alphabet of giving migrants around the world a letter in which they could describe themselves. It was called the A to Z, and what was really interesting was witnessing how migrants had never had the opportunity to describe in their own words who they were. So when you did that, they were thinking, what am I? What's the best adjective to describe myself? And these are some of the words that they came up with. In the best way possible, not really like cheesy or taking their emotions in a really kind of stereotypical way. How can you really engage it? But yeah, and the tagline on my channel was, if you don't define yourself, someone else will, to provide these people a voice in which they could represent themselves in their truest way. And I create the space and I travel around the world, going back to the country of their origin and seeing it, how it connects to the country that they've ended up in today. forming narratives that are a bit more nuanced in approach, with a high focus on quality aesthetics as well. And one story I made, which means a lot to me, was about my grandmother, who was Indonesian. She had an incredible migrant story of how she left Indonesia and why she left Indonesia, but we didn't really know the details because she never really talked about it. And she probably passed away when I was about 2 or 3, so I didn't really get to know her on a level that I wanted. But what I'd realized was that there was such a gap between migrants and their stories and the viewers that it was very unrelatable for most people. So how do you bridge that gap? And I kind of learned through my experience that you have to find an intersection, an emotional intersection in which the viewer is able to relate to the subject. So I used myself as a litmus test and made a story of my grandmother, of this grandson trying to find his place in the world, trying to learn more about his grandmother and why his grandmother left a beautiful country for him to live a better life. And this is some of the video. I'll show you a little bit. It's a cut down as well. This picture is one of few clues I have to my grandmother's origins. I was told that there's a meaning to the batik dress that she's wearing. I took the batik clue to the most famous batik village called Kauman in Solo.
Do we know what kind of kebaya that is?
This one, right?
Ini namanya pecinan.
Your grandmother might be the upper class one because not everyone could wear the anchim, the pecinan batik.
The upper class, they usually
take pictures like that.
Damn, so I come from like upper class.
Yeah.
So my grandma was a classy lady. And the reason this stuck with me is that it was so far removed from the humble and simple life I know she lived in little Mombasa. Why did she come to Africa with nothing, when in Indonesia she had everything? In turn, it taught me that she was a woman who prioritized the hope of her family's future over the grief of her past. I feel like my mind's just exploded. You know when you feel like you know something and then you start from zero? Everything we thought we knew about my grandma, it was wrong. So I thought my grandma was from Solo, but she's actually from
Pari, Kediri.
And Pari, Kediri.
Jawa Timur.
And I feel like a part of me's failed. It's failed. And I'm in the completely wrong place. Finally, I have an address. Jalan Legend Sutoyo. But I don't have time. I have to get to Kediri, no matter what it takes. Oh my god. Legend Sutoyo. The street my grandmother was born and raised in. One thing for sure is that everyone is looking at me.
Aku dari London. But nenek aku no bercampuran.
Oh iya.
But kamu berapa di sini? Berapa tahun di sini?
Saya dari kecil.
Kamu tahu nenek aku?
Siapa namanya? Kok baca?
Ilya.
Hah?
Ilya.
Iya iya. Ingat ya Mas ya. Permisi ya.
Ya.
Tapi lupa banget saya. Namanya itu pernah tahu di sini. Juga di sini betul.
The kind old man showed me my grandmother's address, but it wasn't what I expected. He told me that the Dutch had torn down the house 50 years ago and built a school and a church. Were the Dutch the reason my grandmother left? Here it is. This, you know, of course I would have loved to have seen something of my grandma's here. Some sort of like property or house to kind of see that where she would have grown up in. And unfortunately, I don't have that luxury, but by the time I left the school, word had got round that this crazy foreigner was walking up and down Legend Sutoyo Street asking people if they knew his grandmother. But a nice man found me and invited me back to his house.
Hey, Assalamualaikum. Kabar baik. Nama aku.
Silakan.
This man, Imam Kembali, saw the pictures and immediately recognized my family.
Seperti apa dia?
Oh, orangnya cantik orangnya. Karena dasarnya nenekmu Aliyah itu dari sini. Jadi kamu dapat aliran darah dari sini, dari pari sini. Berhubung sudah merantau kemana-mana ya jauh.
Imam said he had the keys to another house that belonged to my family. A house I never knew existed. This house he took me to was opposite the church and school I was staring at earlier, where my grandmother's house used to be. It was just behind me the whole time. And I never realized.
So I'm feeling a bit like nervous, my hands kind of like shaking. Try and get a light on. Oh, ada. There's a picture. Ada lagi? Ini. Oh my god.
I will take.
We continued rummaging through everything, not entirely sure what I was looking for. Was this all just a waste of time? But just before I gave up hope,
No. Oh my god. Oh my god, oh my god, oh my god. Oh my god, Adam, I found it, Adam. Holy cow. Oh my god. I can't believe it.
there she was,
Oh my god. I can't believe it.
my nene. So yeah, that's the story about my grandmother. It's a story of sacrifice and compromise for the sake of a generation that she probably would never meet. That was a passion project of mine that I'd always wanted to do. It was incredible to make a story that was so emotionally close to me, to connect with viewers who had never had an experience of migration before. And what I realized with a video like this, more so than any other video I made, was that suddenly people had become emotionally invested in a migrant story. And it taught me that to create compelling narratives around migrants, we have to draw on these intersections in which we can both relate with one another. Instead of seeing me as a son of a migrant or a diaspora or as someone quite different, they just saw me as a grandson trying to connect with his grandmother. That was the intersect. A grandmother's love is a relatable experience for most of us. A grandmother's love is unconditional, something even more so than a mother. A mother disciplines you, but there's something about a grandmother that is wholesome and true and just pure love for that grandchild. And people who didn't have migrant backgrounds, I had British people who were, indigenous British people, emotionally involved in the story. And that, for a migrant storyteller, a diaspora storyteller, is the golden snitch. That's what you want. You want to be able to connect with people who don't have a similar experience to you, but they can relate with you on a deeper, more emotional level. And that's what I learned, and that's why I will continue to do in the future. I've made separate videos in Lebanon about a guerrilla gardener in refugee camps in Bakar, and he basically went around creating incredibly beautiful guerrilla gardens. Guerrilla meaning he came and without people knowing it, overnight he would turn a quite derelict and rundown refugee camp into a beautiful space. I've made stories in Myanmar looking at how two best friends bridged the Rohingya and Burmese divide and created a little orphanage of their own. And I will continue to make stories that draw on more emotional nuance to connect people of different backgrounds, and hopefully they intersect on an emotional level. I want to thank you. I'm sorry for taking your time. I went on a bit, but thank you for indulging me for a while. It's an honor and a privilege to be here, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much for such a story, touching story that you have just put in front of us. I think that we will have a few minutes to go to the floor. I don't know if there are already volunteers to put questions. If that is not yet the case, I will just try to take the opportunity while you are thinking about the questions to ask you, when you go back now to Afghanistan, do you feel that there is in the young generation the training of the trainees? In that young generation, you feel that there is hope for them to invest in their qualification and stay in their country? Or the fact that you have a very successful story, when you go back, you feel that they would like to follow your path?
That's a really good question, because that is also the problem with sustainable projects, at least having sustainable projects. But absolutely, I see that every year. I've been back in Afghanistan for every year now for the past 5 years. And it's just amazing how motivated the students there are and how hardworking they are, because at the moment we've got around 30 trainers in Kabul who are training independently. Of course, I am there on a long distance to support them, but they're all working so hard in order to make that group bigger, also the group of the trainers bigger, but they're all so hopeful as well, as you say, for the future, because it is the young generation who is going to make the change. The others are just playing their own political agenda. So I'm really, really thankful for them, and yes, I am hopeful amongst all misery.
You know, because one of the issues that is in the overall debate is to say that everybody realizes the importance of investing in qualifications, in skills, in education, in vocational training. But sometimes there is also the feeling that the qualification in the countries of origin can also be a trigger to migrate, because they feel more self-confident, more prepared, and therefore they maximize the chances if they go abroad. And this is a debate that can be held at, at state level about policies, but it is extremely important to integrate in this macro debate the reality on the ground. Do you have a feeling on that?
Yes, no, absolutely. And I think that's really important as well, because, I mean, as you say, we've trained a lot of students, and not all of them are still in Afghanistan. A lot of them did take the opportunity to go abroad. A lot of them are studying now in the US and in Europe, which I also understand, as you say, because at some point they also feel overqualified, if I may say so, to stay in Afghanistan, or due to any security reasons or whatsoever. But that is, I think, a continuous dilemma. But I think that the solution would not be to not train them, because I think the solution would be to train a bigger group in order to have a small group at least who will stay there and who will continue the trainings and the qualifications.
Thank you so much. Now I turn to my left and say, well, it's very touching that you mention 9/11. Because indeed that was a turning moment where we felt that prejudiced stereotypes would have a boost, at least, to say the least. And it's fairly interesting that you felt the need to come across and build a counter-narrative. From the institutional point of view, and this is a debate ongoing in the United Nations, not just on migration, but migration is definitely on the front line. The message needs to be attached to a face and to a story. The point is how effective can be storytelling in fighting back prejudice that quite often are based on ignorance. One of the most striking elements of our data is that in the vast majority of the countries where there is a strong prejudice against migrants is in the regions where there are less migrants. And so the direct connection with the reality of migrants can make a difference. Can you make that difference?
No, thank you. Definitely. I definitely feel we can make that difference. Otherwise, I think at some level, I wouldn't be doing the work that I do and the work that I feel is important. But I'm really glad you brought the idea of the importance of a counter narrative. For me, initially, I thought the solution was a counter narrative, but I've learned actually I'd rather prefer to be part of an alter narrative. And what is the difference between the two? Is that a counter has to accept the initial narrative. And post 9/11, I didn't agree with the narrative that my community were a problem. Full stop. So why should I counter a prevailing notion that was completely disconnected from reality? And a lot of people from my 9/11 generation had internalized 9/11 so much that they couldn't see their identity beyond 9/11. Their identity had become so formed by trying to break out of this moment that they couldn't imagine a world in which it didn't exist anymore. So the importance of an alter narrative was giving these people a space to realize you are more than the pogroms, you are more than the stereotypes, you are more than the incidents that people would like to define you under. And there's a little subtle nuance and difference in that. And I found liberation in an alter narrative, and it was basically creating a space for young people like me to be like, hey, you are so much more than these defining moments which have nothing to do with you ultimately. And I think in terms of like providing exposure to communities that didn't have migrants as part of their social, this is what's incredible about the digital world, right? Is that you can actually have incredibly immersive exposure to people who are completely different from you. And yes, it can be problematic because it can also be distorted and exploited. But this is why stories that connect on a more subtle, nuanced level, that bridge the gap by using relatable experiences. In my case, it was a story of a grandmother and a grandson. I didn't say anything about me being a migrant. I didn't really say anything about me being someone different or Muslim or a brown multi-ethnic boy. I was just a grandson trying to learn more about his grandmother. And that's a relatable experience around the world. And I think if we're able to do that and draw on those intersections, then even people who have never had an interaction with someone, they will just initially see a grandson trying to connect with his grandmother, and they'll relate on that level. But if I draw from 9/11, and I draw from experiences in which people have no relation to, then they can only see me as far as that. They'll stop relating to me on an emotional level. So the points in which we draw from need to be a lot bigger, a lot more universal and relatable, for people who don't have the experience, the lived experience, to be able to relate to the migrant experience.
But now I'm going to raise what I do recognize is a difficult question, because the feeling I have is that your alter narrative, and I like very much the concept, but your alter narrative as a target public, and the target public appears to be the natives of the countries where migrants are. The point is, how does your alter narrative work with the other migrants inside the migrants community?
That is a really good question. I was having this conversation recently, actually. And it's tough, to be honest with you, because what happens as diaspora and children of migrants is that your experience becomes so detached from the actual migrant experience. And there is a slight disconnect. Whereas I would go back to the countries of my heritage, and actually they would find me very weird. And some of the things where, like, I'm sure you witnessed that in Afghanistan, and it's like, because we're different. We're like the kind of input that we've had over the period of our life has been different, diverse. We have a lot more contributions to the kind of makeup of our identity. And my kind of crisis was thinking, am I Pakistani enough to be Pakistani? Am I British enough to be British? Am I Kenyan enough to be Kenyan? And you're kind of in this weird flux where you're in the middle, where actually as migrants who have moved, or diaspora, or second or first or second generation, it's actually that flux, that middle, that in between, that is the closest place to home. And to be honest with you, like, I tried to like attach home and belonging to a place, and I realized that place doesn't exist because I'm something completely different. It's the flux in between. My migration is so ingrained in my genome that movement is the closest I've ever felt to home. And that's a bit of a weird experience for most, I imagine. But like, I don't feel alienated when I go to a different culture. I actually feel like I can be part of its fabric very quickly. But yeah, in terms of trying to bridge that gap, between the natives. Some of these natives actually haven't even, the thought of migrating hasn't even crossed their mind. But I think people who have undergone that experience, they are suddenly confronted with that reality as soon as they leave their country of residence. And that I would consider those people my audience as well. Okay. But yeah.
Great. Well, is there any pressing question from the floor? Because we are running out of time, and I do not want the chairman to blame me for delaying the start of the next session. If that is not the case, well, I think that we should all recognize that we were privileged to have such both interesting, stimulating and inspiring presentations, and we should thank our speakers for their testimony today here. Thank you. Thank you. Great. It was great. Thank you so much.